Hello and welcome to tonight's episode of History Behind the Page, the live series where you get to know more about the people behind your favorite history pages. Tonight we have New York Times bestselling author Marcus Brotherton on, who has written some of your favorite history books, including Call of Duty with Buck Compton, We Who Are Alive and Remain, The Untold Story of Band of Brothers, Shifty's War, and then his new book that just came out, A Bright and Blinding Sun, which is available to purchase on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and marcusbrotherton.com. So I am very excited to have him on tonight. This is a live Q&A, so you are more than welcome to ask questions. I do ask that on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen there is a question mark bubble. Please submit your questions there, as sometimes they get lost in the comments, and we want to make sure we get to everybody's questions that we can get to. So let's go ahead and get Marcus on here. Oh, hi.
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Good. Thanks so much for coming on.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, awesome. How was your day today?
Good. I'm going to turn you up just a little bit here.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. We're actually, we're almost neighbors, I think, you and I. You know, relatively speaking, in the world today, we're 6 or 7 hours apart, I think, so that's not too bad.
Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah, you're up in Washington, and you were actually down in, like, by the Vancouver area, weren't you?
Yeah, we lived down there for a number of years, and yeah, came home.
Yeah.
To so.
Yeah, I grew up like 20 minutes away from Vancouver, so it's funny that we are like we grew up very close to each other. That's awesome. Yeah, small world. Awesome. Well, let's get the show a rolling, I guess. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started getting into writing? How did that passion come about?
I had kind of always written. My mother was a newspaper journalist,
Mm-hmm.
and so I've been raised with that influence and just always loved writing in school and high school. Worked at a newspaper kind of out of grad school, and it was kind of right at the time when newspapers were taking a big dive downhill.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to freelance in the book world, and I had a former professor who had gone on to become kind of a large-scale editor at one of the New York houses. So he started sending me all this work, and pretty soon, your name kind of gets out there, and I did some books of my own, and so yeah, I went full-time in 2005 in the book world, and I've never looked back.
Yeah, that's awesome. How was writing your first book? What inspired you to like write that first book?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, at the start, I was doing a lot of houseback projects that the house
Mm-hmm.
would be, they'd have a project that they would want to hire a writer for. And so I would come in with their vision in tow, and it was very much writer for hire. When I started doing my my own books, it was a year or two after that. Actually, I freelanced all through my newspaper years as well. So I pulled off a couple of full-length biographies by the time I got into military nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
So probably Buck Compton was the first one that I've ever done on a large scale.
Mm-hmm.
And he lived about 45 minutes from me, and we became great friends through the process. And it was just a really wonderful time.
So have you been somebody who was always into history, or did that develop later in life, or what got you into writing military history?
Yeah, I loved history in school. History and English and social studies were my favorite classes by far. The whole military side of things, or military history in particular, it was, I like to say, just being at the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
It was, my agent knew the attorney for Buck Compton, and that's how that started. And it was as simple as me taking a phone call and my agent going, "Hey, did you ever see the Band of Brothers?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I love that show." And he goes, "Well, Lieutenant Buck Compton lives like 45 minutes from you. He wants to write his memoirs. Would you be interested in helping him?" Of course, I jumped at the chance, hung up the phone, and then in a quieter moment, I'm like, "What have I done?" You know. So some people, I don't know, like I've told that story before, and some people kind of criticize me for, like, because I know there are people who really devote their entire lives to that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I kind of stumble into things. At the same time, I had paid a lot of dues to get to that place that
Of
when
course.
opportunity knocked, I was there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reverse of that equally holds true, that if I didn't take that opportunity, where would I be today? And
Mm-hmm.
when opportunity knocks, have the courage to go. I don't quite know as much as I need to know about this thing, but I'm going to dive in
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to jump at this chance. Uh, when I hung up the phone, I read probably in the next week, probably 20 books cover to cover, just trying to, even before the first meeting with Buck, just really getting up to speed and embracing everything I could.
Mm-hmm. So how was it writing? Because you have four Band of Brothers books, correct? You have We Who Are Alive and Remain, you have Company of Heroes, Shifty's War, and then Call of Duty, correct?
Right.
So did writing Call of Duty kind of escalate the Band of Brothers theme there?
Yeah. Buck was he was a patient teacher. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, I would kind of approach the subject pretty naively. And, what's the difference between a company and a regiment? I mean, those are some of my questions that I was starting out with. And Buck was a patient teacher, and he would walk me through things. And over time, I really got to see that ignorance in some ways became a benefit for the reader, because if I didn't understand something, then the reader wasn't going to understand something.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly military guys, as I've done this now for years and years, there's this kind of a insider jargon that everybody uses, but if you're not on the inside, you don't understand it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think we really helped to broaden Buck's book for a kind of
Mm-hmm.
a larger audience, and yeah, so it went from there.
So how much research and interviewing with Buck and how much time went into that book?
It was probably a 6-month researching and writing process, and then it
Mm-hmm.
goes through the editing process at the publishers, which is another 6 months, and then it came out. And Buck was I want to say he was 85 or 86 when his book came out.
Mm-hmm.
He was still speaking all over the country and going to military shows and whatnot. By that time in his life, he was still pretty high functioning, but he needed kind of like a helper or a handler to get him through the airports and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't really walk very well, long distances, and needed a wheelchair to kind of navigate the airports. So I ended up going on several trips with him at the request of his daughter Tracy, who became just a wonderful friend of mine as well. And yeah, so it was another couple months there of traveling with Buck and just kind of going everywhere with him. So it was great.
Yeah, that is awesome. And that book came out in what year?
I want to say '06.
Oh
Yeah.
six. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the first book of yours that I read was We Who Are Alive and Remain, the Untold Story of Band of Brothers. How did that book come about?
So when I had done Buck's book, I got a call actually from Robin Post, and Robin did Bill and Babe's memoirs. And she had started to meet with a couple of the other guys in the company who wanted to write their books. And at the same time, Robin had another project that she wanted to get to and really couldn't get to this, but she knew it was a really worthy project. So she said, "Hey, Marcus, I've got the contacts of these guys. Why don't you just take it? Why don't you just jump in?" I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." So I met with Herb Sewerth, who was then the company association president, and kind of explained the vision for him. And probably the industry wasn't going to accept like a book from every man in the company.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we decided upon, let's do this compilation memoir, and we'll talk to all the guys who are still alive. That's where the title, sort of originated from. We were alive and remain. We're still here.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually we got 20 of the men in the company to participate in that. And my vision for that was really to, like, I love oral history, and I'd read any number of oral history projects by then. And so I wanted just to kind of step out of the picture and connect the men directly to the reader, kind of like you're
Mm-hmm.
sitting on a front porch with these amazing legends, and they're just, telling their stories. And that's really the tone of that book.
Mm-hmm. It's a really good book. If anybody hasn't, if it's not in anybody's collection yet, I highly, highly recommend it. And then afterwards, did that kind of piggyback off Company of Heroes, the memoirs of the family and everything?
Yeah, so I had been to a number of Easy Company reunions by that point. I had met any number of the adult age children of the veterans, and many of their fathers had passed away by then. But there was all these incredible stories out there and just sort of treasure troves of information. And so I started talking to the kids. Hey, let's do a book about your fathers. We don't want these stories to fade away either.
Mm-hmm.
And they love the idea. It's like, yeah, you know, you're kind of shining the spotlight on our dads, and that's really cool. And you know, that book, it's very interesting because the family members that I interviewed, they were warm-hearted and yet unvarnished in their telling of stories, which is really good. Like, we're not trying to sort of be attorneys and pigeonhole people into telling horrible stories at all. But many of the family members said, you know, when my dad came home from the war, here's how that went. There were some good things and some not so good things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we don't want to dishonor his memory. At the same time, it's probably important for people nowadays to know these things, that when
Mm-hmm.
people do come home from war, yeah, there are, you know, big adjustment periods, and you know, they've been through horror and now they're trying to readjust to everyday life. So
Mm-hmm.
really, there was just a huge honesty and vulnerability, I think, in the family members who told their stories there.
Yeah. How long did that interview process take with, how did you find the family members? How did you find the people that you wanted to interview for the book?
I had met, like Dan Potter Jr. By then, and George Luz Jr., and you know, Tracy Compton, and just sort of anybody and everybody who sort of knew somebody who knew somebody. And
Mm-hmm.
they talked amongst themselves, and I made a lot of phone calls and emails, and yeah, just, you know, word got out. Hey, you're writing a book. My dad was there, and yeah, so it took off from there.
Yeah. So besides doing the interviews with the person with the book is about, like with the family members or with Buck Compton, did you do your own research too outside of that, or was it all just based on interview processes?
I do try and verify things as much as possible. I mean, oral history, like, I love oral history because it just feels so raw. I just want to
Mm-hmm.
say that you're just talking with the guy. Um, at the same time, I do know that oral history can sometimes be pushed. You know, like when a story gets told more than once, when a story gets told 100 times over 60 to 70 to 80 years, sometimes variance can creep in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, as much as possible, yes, I do want to verify things, or at least, you know, talk to another guy who's there and sort of compare stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I will often, you know, put in the end notes, just address those variants, and say, you know, some guys say this and some guys say this. Really, it was probably this, and most people think that it was like this. So I do want to know, I want the reader to know that, yeah, you know, these variants do exist, particularly in oral history.
What is one of the toughest things about doing an oral history book with the interviews and getting the book together? What is one of the toughest processes of that?
Yeah, so winning the trust of veterans, I would say, is not necessarily easy. Many of the vets, at least that I've talked to, when they came home, I mean, they didn't talk to anybody, and not even their
Mm-hmm.
family members, or it took a lot of years before that happened. And so when I came in, particularly to Easy Company, I was a bit of an outsider. And by then, you know, the men, my goodness, like, I went to an air show with a man where people lined up for, it was probably an hour in the broiling sun, just
Mm-hmm.
to meet these guys and shake their hands and get their signatures. And so, you know, they loved meeting people. At the same time, they were a little bit wary by then because so much fame had been bestowed upon them. So when I came in as an outsider there, they were like, okay, now who are you, and why do you want to talk to us, and, you know, why should we talk with you? And you know, a number of these guys were they're pretty tough guys. Like they could, you know, they might be 85, but they could still like really hurt you in a fight. And so fortunately, you know, I had Buck Compton on my side, and a
Mm-hmm.
number of the guys literally, you know, picked up the phone and called Buck and said, "Who is this kid? And
Mm-hmm.
what's he trying to do?" And you know, Buck vouched for me and just said, "Hey, he's all right, and here's his vision, and you know, he wants you to be able to tell your stories, so you know, future generations are aware of that." Um, that you know, We Are Alive and Remain came out in, I want to say, '08, '07 or '08.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are, 2022, and all of the men featured in that book have passed on by now, like every
Mm-hmm.
single man. And that was, I think, even in hindsight, like that project takes on poignancy. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, okay, like I knew, I felt the importance of it at the time. Now in hindsight, with all those guys gone, it's like, yeah, okay, I'm really so glad we got their stories on paper.
Yeah, definitely for future generations to read, and then even people nowadays too, because yeah, our vets are, you know, they're at the end stages of their lives right now. So we're that generation is slowly dying, is sadly dying off. But when you are doing the interviews with veterans, is there any hard emotional parts to it?
Oh yeah, um,
Yeah.
yeah. There were, well, starting with Buck. I mean, there were times, you know, you think about the story of these guys. They're trained to be elite soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
Buck parachuted into Normandy. You know, he's shot people. He's killed people. He played football for UCLA. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
uh, kind of a very very tough guy, manly man. He became a judge later on in life, and he prosecuted Sirhan for the
Mm-hmm.
murder of Bobby Kennedy. So if there was ever a guy with fortitude and strength and grit, it was Buck Compton. At the same time, when he told us stories, there were times he broke down and wept.
Mm-hmm.
And to be sitting across the table with Buck Compton and he's sobbing, and it's kind of a strange process where, you know, you flip on a recorder and get a guy talking and get a guy comfortable, and then for me, I just shut up. I basically go silent and just let him talk as long as he wants to talk. And then sometimes even I'll say, "Hey, hey, that's great. That's all we need to do today, and let's conclude the interview." And then kind of quietly, I'll just leave the recorder on, and then he'll relax even more and say, "Oh,
Mm-hmm.
okay, the interview's over." And then sometimes some of the best stories would come out.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say in reliving some of the pieces of the war, yeah, there were huge emotional pieces there that that he was exploring even with me, even being given that opportunity to talk it out.
Mm-hmm. How was that emotionally for you when you were hearing these stories and seeing the emotions of these veterans? And how was that for you?
Yeah, I felt it all.
Mm-hmm.
I felt it all empathetically. I mean, obviously, I'm not there
Mm-hmm.
experiencing the horror firsthand. It's shocking to think of some of the events that the men went through.
Mm-hmm.
I talked with uh, Joe Lesniewski, for instance, when the men were going to Bastogne. He was one of the guys where he had turned in his boots in Mormillon, right? Because he needed to get his boots resoled. And then this order came, hey, you know, Hitler's broken through the line, everybody rush up to the front, and, you know, we got to save the world, literally.
Mm-hmm.
And so Joe jumps on a truck and he doesn't have any boots. I mean, it's you know, winter, 30 degrees below zero. And he's one of the guys, he's wrapping his feet in burlap bags, going to fight an enemy in the snow. I mean, it's a powerful story to think about, and then to talk to the man who actually lived it, and he would kind of any number of the guys would talk about their experiences with kind of like a nudge in the ribs and a bit of humor. Like,
Mm-hmm.
well, you know, at least my feet didn't freeze then, and you know, I had it better than some of the guys that were wearing boots.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you could see the sadness still, or the hurt.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Herb Sureth talked about how he couldn't look outside on a winter day 70 years later. He couldn't look at snow and he would shiver,
Mm-hmm.
and the memories would still flood back to him even now today.
Ooh, that's, yeah. I couldn't imagine doing those interview processes, the feelings and the emotions and seeing everything with those veterans is just, that's a lot. Um, so let's talk a little bit about A Bright and Blinding Sun. So, how did this come about?
At the start of COVID, I had gathered a stack of very obscure World War II manuscripts to read,
Mm-hmm.
because, who doesn't love reading a really good, obscure World War II manuscript?
Mm-hmm.
So it was probably halfway down in the pile was this independently published book, manuscript called Baby of Bataan by Joseph Quitman Johnson. And I kind of, picked it out of the pile and I read through it, and wow, it just grabbed me. Read through it straight in 2 days. And Joseph had died in 2017 at age 91, but his family kept this very small Facebook tribute page, maybe 70, 80 people on it. And I reached out to the family just to convey my thanks and say, wow, like Joe was just this amazing guy. Thank you so much for, supporting him and his life. So I got an email right after that from a guy named Steve Gregg, who's the executor of the state. And he said, hey, I recognize your name. You've written some books. Can I give you a call? I said, absolutely. We started talking on the phone. He's like, hey, here's the story. Joe, independently published this manuscript. And as the story goes, he sold 600 copies out of his garage, and that's it. And his story is just too good to let fade away. What would you think about, retelling it? Make it your own book, research it, and there's 12 family members you can still talk to, friends of his that are still alive. I'm like, yeah, this is cool. There was literary precedent for doing that. I mean, Dick Winters had two memoirs written about him. Of course, Louis Zamperini, he had two books written about him. And so I knew that the community would accept that, so I dove in, and we got the contract with Hachette, Little Brown, and started to tell Joe's story, hopefully to a wider audience.
So when you are doing a book on somebody who has passed and you are interviewing family members, you do have his manuscript. Is there a lot more research process that goes into that versus, because he's not here anymore, so you can't interview him, but what is the research process like that to get all the information for your
Yeah, that's a
books?
great question. Because all of this book is true. People have asked me before, wow, it just kind of reads like a novel, and the events are sort of so horrific. Did all
Mm-hmm.
this really happen to one guy? Yeah, it did. There's cross-checking with after-action reports and textbooks, and you name it. Joe had left behind this wealth of information, boxes of journals and writings and emails that he left, and poetry that he wrote. This warrior with a seventh grade education who wrote poems. He had actually written two manuscripts to start off with. And one manuscript I had. The other manuscript was one he had written before that. It was so rare that the estate itself didn't have it. Fortunately, there was three known copies, known in existence. I was able to track down one of those copies and then compare them. The first manuscript that Joe wrote about his experiences, he'd actually written in the third person voice.
Mm-hmm.
Joe did this, Joe did that. And then the second one, which he eventually independently published, he had written in the first person voice, I did this, I did that. I found that fascinating in and of itself. It's kind of like when he started down to write, he had to take a step back and separate himself from his experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And then once he kind of wrote one version of it, he was able to kind of relax and go, okay, I am going to jump back into this with my whole heart and tell the story again from my eyes. So there were variants and there were different stories between the two, absolutely, and there was greater insight to compare the two. So yeah, that was a
Mm-hmm.
fascinating piece of it.
Yeah. So you started A Bright and Blinding Sun at the beginning of COVID.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So wait, what year is it? So 2 years to get the book from start to finish.
yeah. 2 years.
It is a really good book, guys. Again, it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and MarcusBrotherton.com. I highly recommend it. So I'm about three-fourths the way through, so I'm excited to finish it off. So all of the books that you have written, based on World War II, what has been the toughest one for you to write?
Yeah, I did a book with Adam Makos in 2013 called Voices of the Pacific. It was another oral
Mm-hmm.
history project. Um, Unlike the Men of Easy Company, there was no sort of one association for the Marines of K-35. And Adam, who's a fantastic historian, he had spent a couple of years tracking these men down and winning their trust and convincing them that to tell their stories. He was pretty new to the publishing process, and we had met several times at air shows and military shows. And so he said, "Hey, Marcus, you've done some oral history before. Let's partner up for this book." So I would say the stories there were bloodier than the European theater,
Mm-hmm.
and there was more. Well, I mean, you saw the Pacific, right, from
Mm-hmm.
HBO.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and when you're comparing the Pacific to Band of Brothers, what would you say that the biggest differences are in tone?
The tone, it's a lot grittier, it's a lot gory, it's a lot, I mean, obviously both sides, the ETO and the PTO, they all had their own things, but it seemed like the guys in the PTO and in the Pacific, they got everything handed to them, and it was, yeah, it was bloody battle. All battles are bloody, but for some reason the Pacific feels like they just got it more.
Yeah, that's well put. A number of the men, when I spoke with them, they had not gone through, I would say, the process of healing, the
Mm-hmm.
process of extending forgiveness. They carried a grudge to this day. Forgiveness is tricky. Forgiveness is difficult. I mean, how do you sort of forgive somebody that they're not coming to you, the enemy's not coming to you and apologizing. You can
Mm-hmm.
kind of extend forgiveness. As Joe Johnson puts it, you can sort of lay that hurt down. A number of these guys hadn't. And one guy said, I would never ever drive a Japanese car, not to this day. And
Mm-hmm.
he said it with a lot of, expletives and things like that, that we've put a few of those in for the book, but there are larger parts of that were just almost too raw and too emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, they were still feeling it and still feeling it intensely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
With Voices of the Pacific, with you and Adam, were you guys able to interview veterans, or was this all veterans who had passed?
This is all direct interviews. Yeah, it's
Okay.
oral history, so it's their stories, and we met them in person, and yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Sid Phillips, remarkable man.
Mm-hmm.
He's in the book, so
So interviewing somebody who fought, somebody like Buck Compton who fought, ugh, sorry, I'm tripping over my words, who fought in the European theater, hearing his stories versus somebody who fought in the Pacific, did you see a huge contrast of how they shared their stories and their emotions and what went on with that?
there were. That's a great question. Like Frank Sobolewski, who's one of the Band of Brothers, he was not a talker at all. And the only way that he could participate in We Were Alive and Remain was if he told the stories to his wife, Renee, and she
Mm-hmm.
actually typed them up for him. Interesting, Renee called me, and a couple years later, uh, when Frank had passed away, and she said, once that book came out, he was so stinking happy, and the book, it's like it gave him a couple extra years of life because he
Mm-hmm.
loved to talk about it and sort of go around and share copies of it. That's a remarkable privilege that I'm like super honored to be part of. Like, wow, to actually give a guy a couple of years of life, extra years of life, if that's truly
Mm-hmm.
the case. Um, so yeah, there was a reticence to talk on both sides of the theater for sure.
Mm-hmm.
and that process of coaxing the stories out or getting them out any way we could. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think with from what I've seen, I guess, you saying that you gave him a few years of life, I feel from speaking to other veterans and hearing their stories, you know, they didn't talk about that for a long time. They kept it suppressed. They just didn't talk about it because it was a traumatic experience for them, obviously. And then they have these people now like you who want to write about them and tell their story and let them know that they're heroes and they did a great job. And that probably gives them like you know, a great feeling inside and makes it a little bit lighter of what they went through and telling their stories. So I think that's just a thought of mine. But so when you collaborated with Adam, like how does that work with two authors doing one book?
On that particular book, we kind of divvied up the list, and
Mm-hmm.
then I did a series of initial interviews, if I remember that correctly, and then he knew a couple of the guys just personally quite well, so he did a couple more interviews with maybe a third of the guys. I've worked on Adam with on both his book A Higher Call and his book
Mm-hmm.
Devotion, and so yeah, it's I was the editor of his first book and writing partner on his second book, and so Adam and I have done a number of projects together. Me kind of behind the scenes in some of those. Adam is great to work with. He has a huge heart for the veterans. He knows his stuff. Devotion's getting turned into a movie this October. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to come out, and so there's a lot of excitement about that. So it's yeah, it's been great to see you know, Adam sort of really progress in his career and really, you know, hit the mark. So.
Mm-hmm. So I know that you've oh my gosh, sorry, excuse me. I know that you've written, you know, books about World War II and an oral history about the veterans. What other scope have you done?
I do a lot of books in collaboration with people, and my name is on maybe half of them, which is okay. I mean, I've got my own readership, and so when I don't have my name on the front cover of a book, it kind of gives me freedom to dive into different genres
Mm-hmm.
and help guys out. I do a number of faith-based books. I'm the
Mm-hmm.
writing partner for a guy named Louis Giglio, who's a pastor in Atlanta, and I've done his last 4 or 5 books at least. He's a great guy. He's got just a big heart for helping people.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, I've got a novel in the works that I'm doing in conjunction with Tosca Lee, who's a fantastic novelist who lives in Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to come out about a year from now, and it's in the editing pipeline right now. And yeah, it was super, super fun to work with her. So.
So do you prefer doing the oral history and everything that you have been doing, or do you want to venture off into other things?
Yeah, I love oral history. It's the opportunities are fading away. You know,
Mm-hmm.
16 million Americans fought in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Or actually, pardon me, they didn't fight necessarily, but they were part of the armed services.
Mm-hmm.
About 1 million of them fought, and then the other 15 million were, you know, support services,
Yeah.
the cooks and drivers and whatnot. Anyway, from that 16 million, we have about 250,000 left. So, and they're dying, just as you mentioned, now just dying so rapidly now. So yeah, that generation has almost passed away now. And I was just talking with Tim Gray of the World War II Foundation about this,
Mm-hmm.
you know, this very issue. It's like, well, what are we going to do when there's no one left to talk to? And part of the solution, I think, is to go to the family members, you know,
Mm-hmm.
as we've been doing here, and because there's many stories here that need to be either told for the first time or retold and brought to a bigger audience, and yeah, so we can. There's lots more work to be done for sure.
Yeah. Would you ever venture off into other conflicts like Korea or Vietnam or current conflicts that are going on?
I have, yes. So I collaborated on a book in 2016, 2015 called Tough as They Come
Mm-hmm.
with Staff Sergeant Travis Mills, who's in Afghanistan. I just did a book about 2.5 years ago called Blaze of Light with
Mm-hmm.
Gary Bykrick, who's Medal of Honor recipient. He fought in Vietnam. So, you know, it's good to be aware of these projects and to, I think, for us to read these books and watch these movies. And uh, in the sense that just many noble things happened during those time periods. Vietnam, for instance, does not have, just very pragmatically, does not have the built-in readership that World War II has.
Mm-hmm.
So it's harder to do a Vietnam book than World War II, just in terms of selling it. But I admit, Gary Bycrick, he had a fantastic story. He was just a wonderful human being who'd worked through so many issues in his life and come out the other side just a calm, generous, empathetic person. And his story was so fantastic. I mean, he had fought in Vietnam and then come home and kind of, you know, received the Medal of Honor and kind of threw it in a duffel bag and went off to live in a cave for the next 7 years, or the next 2 years.
Yeah.
And it was 7 years before he actually ever picked up the Medal of Honor again and started to wear it. So there was a fantastic story there that I knew needed to be told, and that was my big motivation for working with him.
Yeah. When you were talking with Gary for Light Ablaze and then versus interviewing veterans of World War II, was there a big difference between interviewing somebody from the Vietnam War versus World War II?
Well, with Vietnam, the big dynamic there was coming home, whereas World War II veterans, you know, some of them received ticker tape parades. Some of them just sort of came home to anonymity. But there was a general feeling in the country there that we're just so happy for what you've done.
Mm-hmm.
Contrast to Vietnam, where, you know, Gary Bycrick, when he came home, he was literally spit upon and you know, shoved when he was walking down the hallway in university and harassed for being a veteran. So there was this big sort of home front issue to surface in the book and then to address, and then you know, I think we as a country, as a new generation, I think the feelings, I believe, toward Vietnam veterans have completely changed. Anyone I've ever talked to these days just says, you know, hey, Vietnam veterans, fantastic, a difficult war, a war that wasn't necessarily black and white, or big pieces of it weren't black and white, and yet you were doing your job. Many of you guys were drafted, and you know, you're still fighting for the cause of freedom, even though the conflict is messy. So I think there's a lot of gratitude now, today, toward Vietnam veterans. I hope I'm right about that. Yeah.
I think that you are, and I think people now are getting a little bit more interested in Vietnam a little bit more. You know, Vietnam and Korea, they both are very confusing and difficult wars to learn about. They're not as Preston Stewart from War Stories, he made a really good point. He goes, they're very difficult wars to learn about. They're not as simple as World War II. Not saying World War II is simple, but learning about it is completely different than trying to keep track of what happened in Vietnam and Korea. So I think definitely that's progressing and learning, especially now that the generation, you know, the veterans of World War II are passing. So now we're going on to the next generation of Korea, Vietnam, and then soon it'll be, you know, Operation Iraqi Freedom in, you know, the next decade or all that stuff. But if you could write about any part in history or any topic of it, what would it be? What is something that is like your dream book to write?
Really, that was fulfilled in A Bright and Blinding Sun. I had it started with Buck Compton again. One day we were sitting in the airport on a speaking tour that he was doing, and he was telling me all about Bastogne, and you know, for the kind of the 10th time. Not that I objected, and I was saying, man, you guys really had it rough in Bastogne. Outgunned, outmanned, freezing conditions, no food. And Buck kind of paused and he said, yeah, he said, Bataan, or he said, Bastogne was really rough. And then he said, but at least I wasn't in the Pacific. He said, man, those guys had it really rough. So that line stayed with me for several years. When Adam and I did our book, you know, that gave me a broader exposure to what Buck was talking about. But I really wanted to focus on one veteran from the Pacific and tell his story really in depth, and that was handed to me with A Bright and Blinding Sun. So,
oh, that's awesome. We have some questions here. Let's see. Um, Freddie Joe Farnsworth wants to know, do you find that after the release of Band of Brothers in the Pacific, did you find that the veterans in those theaters opened up more than before?
Yes, yeah, great question. It's a number of the veterans talked about how they were, boy, almost hesitant. Uh, so much of the spotlight had been focused on them, and they would be like, we were really, we did good things, but we were just one company out of many, many who did good
Mm-hmm.
things. Why was so much attention focused on us? That was a question I heard a lot, and they would say, well, you should talk to the guys from Dog Company or whatever it was,
Mm-hmm.
because they did some really great things too. So the veterans would talk about how the HBO series, both of them really, they gave, I think, a really broader audience the
Mm-hmm.
opportunity to see these conflicts up close. If a person is not into military history,
Mm-hmm.
then you're kind of left out of the loop. But the HBO series broadened that. Like I watched Band of Brothers way back when it first came out back in
Mm-hmm.
'01. I wouldn't necessarily classify myself as a big military aficionado back then,
Yeah.
but it because of its broad reach, that drew me in, and
Mm-hmm.
now I'm a huge super fan.
Yeah.
Kind of see and read everything. So yeah, the HBO series and Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, I mean, they really gave all of us much,
Mm-hmm.
and the veterans, many of them did notice that for sure.
Yeah. Band of Brothers definitely created history nerds that they didn't know they were history nerds
Right.
at the time, and then they watch Band of Brothers and they're like, oh no. And that was like the end of it for for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Let's see. Um, at Restoration Co. He's really awesome. He goes to veterans in the cemeteries and cleans their headstones and maintains them. So super thank you for that. Sorry, I flung my pencil. He wants to know if you're going to do any more collaborations with Medal of Honor recipients.
Yeah, I would love to. We Woody Williams just passed away. Was it yesterday? And I think everyone's
Yesterday.
just going, fortunately, he had told his story.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many other great ones out there that have
Yeah.
not been told yet. To work with Gary Bykrick, Gary Bykrick, he gave me a whole education as to the medal. For instance, it's not won; it's received, and there's specific terminology, and yet all the terminology sort of holds forth. And the the veterans who wear the medal are almost united in their respect for it, their reverence for it, their understanding of its greater implications for all veterans who do noble things,
Mm-hmm.
and almost their hesitancy in wearing the medal because they
Mm-hmm.
understand its enormous weight. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about what a rare medal that is. Um, Maybe 2,100 medals have been given in the history of the medal,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. I think there's maybe 70 still living recipients alive today who've received it. So, compared with all, and this is since the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a huge span of time, and so very few people have ever received it. It is very significant in what it entails. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What is the hardest thing of getting a book from start to finish?
Hmm. Well, the book world in and of itself is
Mm-hmm.
is a steep learning curve, and it's so you got to learn the ropes for sure. And then even when it's there, I think that the difficulty with books these days is that so many other things compete for our attention, right? Um, what used to be that when you when you jumped on a plane, you'd read a book,
Mm-hmm.
and You know, these days we're all staring at screens, even on an airplane.
Yeah.
And we have, you know, just so many other things to steal our attention. So I
Mm-hmm.
think the readership of books, it's, I don't know if it's shrinking, but it could grow more than it is.
Mm-hmm.
The book industry in the last, since 1990 has gone through probably as large a revolution as the music industry has. So there used to be something like 5,000 bookstores in America. Today there are about 1,200. So there's just so few brick and mortar bookstores
Yeah.
left in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Most of us discover our books through Amazon or, you know, through word of mouth. And so to amplify a book and have it reach people, um, yes, you know, go out today and buy my book and pass it to a friend and buy 10 copies for Christmas, please.
Yeah. Well, I'm one of those people that I can't do like Kindle books. I can do audiobooks, but if I do audiobooks, I have to actually be reading the book at the same time. But I like books, like an actual book. And it's, yeah, I completely agree with that in regards to books. I remember there was a Borders bookstore by me, and I would spend so many times there when I was younger, when I was a kid. And I remember when they closed, I was so devastated. They closed in my city. I was like, no, what am I going to do on like a Friday night?
Was that
Can't go
Borders
wander.
in Vancouver on 162nd?
It was Border in Gresham in
Okay.
Oregon. Yeah. So, yeah, I just remember when Borders closed, I was so devastated. I was
Yeah,
so
we faced the
devastated.
same thing. We had a Borders like right
Yeah.
down from our street, and I
They
would go
all
there.
closed.
Literally, I would go there every Sunday, and just,
Yeah.
you know, peruse books. And then it closed. And it's like, come on, what are we gonna do?
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, I was so sad when they closed down. Um, Matt Manning wants to know, with the passing of Woody, do you think there will be an increased emphasis on telling stories for those Medal of Honor recipients still living from Korea on?
Yeah, I sure hope so. The stories are there, and I think if the readership continually, as we're doing right here today, calls out for these books, you know, publishers are going to be more aware of that, more open to them. It
Mm-hmm.
was hard to get Gary Beitrick's book through,
Mm-hmm.
and just the initial stages, it was sort of everyone kind of went, you know, Vietnam doesn't sell. Are you sure you want to do this book? I talked to sort of several people in the chain, and that was her story. And then I did the proposal. I sat down with Gary, and we got his story. I did the proposal, which is kind of a long document that explains the story. And once the story was out there, kind of in a condensed outline form, then
Mm-hmm.
the book actually, it went to a 5-way auction. 5 different publishers were interested in that, simply because they went, "Holy cow! What an amazing story! We all want this." And so it was overcoming that hurdle of Vietnam doesn't sell. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it could, and it should, and it needs to, and we
Mm-hmm.
need to keep sort of, you know, beating down that door and saying these stories need to be told. They're so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Would you be interested in doing more stuff on Vietnam?
I think so. Yeah. If
Mm-hmm.
if another great story comes along, I'm all ears. Yeah.
Yeah. What is one of the what was one of the proudest moments in your writing career?
Wow. It's I had I had met Babe Heffron
Mm-hmm.
at a military show. You know Babe.
Mm-hmm.
Babe was kind of a crusty, hard-edged fire plug of a man, toughest of the tough.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there with Buck, and Buck was he was not feeling well on that
Mm-hmm.
particular trip, and he had a headache that just wouldn't go away. He was in a wheelchair for a lot of the time, and he hated being in the wheelchair because he liked to walk just everywhere he could.
Mm-hmm.
But there was just times where he kind of went, "Oh, Marcus, just wheel me back to the hotel." So I was with Buck, and Babe was there, and Bill Garnier was there, and a couple of the other guys. And at the end of the show, it was like a 3-day event. At the end of the show, I had wheeled Buck to the van that was taking us places, and then he had forgotten something, and so I went back to the table, which was, I don't know, a quarter of a mile away. And on my way back to the table, Babe Heffron was walking toward me, and he was surrounded by, you know, not an entourage, but just a group of people who hung out with him.
Yeah.
And he broke away from the pack, and he came over to me and he shook my hand. And but it's still emotional today. And I was with a guy who knew Babe very well, and Babe just didn't do that, you know. And so I turned to my friend who I was with, and I said, "What? Wow!" And you know, Babe kept on walking after that. And I said, "Wow, what just happened?" And he said, "Well, you're looking after his friend."
Oh my!
Yeah, that's why.
That is such a great moment.
It was Babe's care of Buck that was the powerful thing there. You know, I was just kind of doing my job, but in Babe's mind, it's like, if you're looking out for my buddy, you're okay.
Yeah. Oh, that is such a great moment. Oh, thanks for sharing that. That's that is truly a great moment. So let's see. Sorry, I have my little book of questions. I got to write them down or else I'll forget about them. So when you are writing a book, when you're on a new book project, how do you find inspiration?
Inspiration, I think, is a big piece of it, where I'm looking for the powerful, poignant story, and both pieces of those are evident. Military nonfiction readers, I think we all look toward the action and the power. We want to hear about the guys parachuting into Normandy. We want to hear about how Joe Johnson, as a 16-year-old, survived the POW camps. And yet so the action's got to be there, right? And yet the poignancy is the veteran who's giving a French child a candy bar in Normandy, and the kid's never tasted chocolate yet. I mean, it's kind of that moment that catches in your throat, and you get, oh my goodness. And so I'm looking for those pieces that they are poignant because they show all of our greater humanity at play. That's why we resonate with them. We go, yes, okay, yes, the kid needs a chocolate bar, and he hasn't had a chocolate bar because he's living in this system of oppression. And so our sense of justice gets raised. So I'm looking for that power and that poignancy, definitely, and I want to serve that. And its applications to us, to our lives. It makes our lives different or better when we think about it, when we ingest these stories into our lives. When I was doing the We Were Alive and Remain, I was looking for a new car, or new used car, and so I was at this car auction, and it was in December, and it's like snowing, and we're out there with the auctioneer, and it's freezing cold, and I'm kind of stamping my feet on the ground, going, "Oh, this is miserable." And then I go, "Yeah, but if the guys can traverse Bastogne, at least I can stand for an hour and a half to get this car at the auction or whatever." It changes our lives to be inspired by these men.
What do you hope your readers gain from reading your books?
We want to develop gratitude. Stephen Ambrose talked about how when we find out what we've been given, we want to know who to thank. And I confess huge ignorance about what veterans have done until I really started this process 15 years ago. I lived in this blanket of security, and I had no idea what people had done for me. The fact that I can write books for a living, and that I'm not sort of working in some Nazi factory, I mean, that's a result of World War II. The fact that I can sit here talking to you in freedom and make my own choices and not sort of, bend my knee to Hirohito's grandson, that's the product of World War II. We all benefit from this mammoth world-changing experience. And the people who risk their lives and lay down their lives so that we can live, we have to, as a generation, as a new generation, realize that enormity. It produces gratitude. It produces, and this is what I really want to get across, it produces a true sense of freedom in us when we understand what freedom is. So freedom is not the ability to do whatever we want whenever we want to. That's anarchy. Freedom is the opportunity to make something of our lives. We don't have to go work for the slave factory. We can do something noble and honorable and empathetic and selfless with our lives. Fantastic. It is up to us to do that. Use the freedom that we've been given.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that one. So what, I know you mentioned a novel earlier. What is down the pipeline for Marcus Brotherton?
Yeah, so the novel that's coming out is called The Long March Home. It's set in Brotherton. Tosca Lee and I wrote it together, and it's, we wrote it just because we believe in this story and this era of history, and the larger story of what happened in the Pacific. And Tosca is a fantastic novelist. Like, that's all she writes. And so I was talking to her one day, and she's like, Marcus, I don't know anything about Brotherton. And I'm like, well, let's write a book about it.
Yeah.
She was talking about how like novelists and then people who read nonfiction, sometimes they mix, but often they don't. And same thing when our acquisition editor first read our manuscript, and we turned it in, she was like, oh my goodness, I had no idea that people actually went through this. And so she went through that whole process of going, experiencing gratitude and experiencing that wow factor. And so to bring these stories to readers who don't read nonfiction, that's really the goal there. Let's get this story out there, and let's tell it in a novel. Sure.
Yeah, no, that is super awesome. So the Brotherton, and when do we expect that book to be hitting the shelves?
I think it's spring 2023. I don't know the date. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So next year, next spring, new book. So how has A Bright and Blinding Sun? How has the release been?
It's been fun. It's been we've done this little picture campaign on social media. You might have seen some of it, and where people take pictures of themselves reading a book or their loved ones reading the book, and people have totally gotten into that, and it's been just fun and funny to see some of the pictures they've sent back, because some of them are serious, but some of them are sort of exaggerated, and a guy will go stick reading a book or whatever. But it's been, I think the piece of that is that, books truly do connect us. And the stories have been from all overseas, and Sweden and California and Florida and Texas and Nebraska and Maine. And it's fantastic to see, I think, to feel that sense of togetherness. Like, yeah, we're all spread out, and yet we're all sort of reading the same story and grappling with the same themes, and hopefully becoming richer people because of it. So that's been a lot of fun.
Definitely. And you guys, the book, Marcus Brotherton's new book, A Bright and Blinding Sun, you can buy it on Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, and marcusbrotherton.com. So definitely pick up your copy, because it is definitely a book you can't put down. So Marcus, I want to thank you so much for coming on. This has been seriously such a fun time, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking with everybody and talking a little bit about writing and your books and all that stuff. So
well, thanks. And I want to put in just a plug for you to your readers and your viewers. The thing that I have really observed about your social media posts and just the various activities you are undertaking as you display them, there's a huge sense of joy in that. And it's been really fun because, a lot of the historians I talk to are kind of, crusty, or just, they want to get every detail right. And so it just gets, kind of boring when it comes out. Not necessarily boring, but it's just kind of dry. You are the opposite of dry in your presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Really, really fun to see. So Yeah.
That
Way to
means a
go.
lot.
Keep up the good
Yeah.
work.
Thank you so much, Marcus. That really means a lot. So,
Great.
well, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. This will be available to watch after the live is over. It'll also be uploaded on YouTube tomorrow too as well. But anyways, yeah, Marcus, have a great night, and thank you so much for coming on.
Great. Thanks, Sarah.
All right. Bye.